Pale Flower movie review. So this is one of my scripted movie review series in which I take an old review that I wrote years ago on the blog and make a YouTube video out of it for whatever that may or may not be worth. In this case, I'm reading my review of the 1964 Japanese movie, Pale Flower. So this movie came out in Japan in 1964 and was part of the new wave of Japanese cinema that came out during the 1960s. I saw this movie back in 2012. And I saw it in 2012 because 2012 was the year that Roger Ebert, who was still alive at the time, Roger Ebert added it to his list of the greatest films of all time list. So at that time, Roger Ebert was keeping a list on his website where he would review some of his, what he considered to be the greatest films of all time, write a review of it, and then add that to his website. Roger Ebert has written a very intelligent review of this film, which I encourage everyone to check out. I especially encourage everyone to check it out because Roger Ebert's review of this film is a lot more intelligent than mine. So, advance warning, your time may well be better spent reading Roger Ebert's review instead of listening to mine. And I'll leave the link to his review in the description down below. But, he got this film, and I didn't. I struggled to engage with it as best as I could, but I didn't really get this film. Anyways, I saw it in 2012 because at the time I was working with a guy who was really into films. I called him the cinephile. He was a guy who had done a film studies degree back in college. He was really obsessed with films. He had not managed to find work in the film industry, which I think is fairly common for a lot of these guys who do film studies degree. But he loved it as a hobby. And so he was always talking about classic films and wanting to invite me over to watch classic films. And all these obscure films I never heard of, you know, German or French or whatever. And he was also into Japanese New Wave cinema. And I had spent 8 years living in Japan. I hadn't picked up a lot of classic Japanese cinema while I was there, but was still vaguely interested in Japanese culture and films. So when Roger Ebert added this to his list of the greatest films of all time, my friend, the cinephile, read Roger Ebert's review and got really excited about it and really wanted to see this movie. So he was one of these guys who is very good at finding stuff on the internet and downloading it. So he downloaded a copy and he invited me and one other friend over. And the three of us watched the film together. Now, after the film finished, he immediately started talking about how beautiful the cinematography was, which is exactly the type of thing you'd expect somebody who is a film studies major to talk about, huh? I'm not a film studies major, so the cinematography is not quite so important to me, although I admit it was very impressive. But I immediately said, okay, fine, the cinematography's great, but what about the story? There was hardly any story, and what little story there was didn't make a lot of sense, and the story got drawn out way more than it needed to be. The film was only 90 minutes. But am I the only one who felt like it seemed to last way longer than that? And my friend replied, he said, yes, but it's film noir. Film noir has always been about style over substance. Now, there are probably a lot of people out there who enjoy films that are more style over substance. And Roger Ebert as well seems to really like the style of this film. I'm not one of them. So I'm coming into this film from a disadvantage, meaning I'm not keyed up to appreciate all the beautiful cinematography that's going on here. But that being said, just because I give my 2 cents on every movie I see, here are my 2 cents. If it is true that film noir is always about style over substance, then it must be admitted that this film does have style. It's a gangster film, and the gangsters do a good job of looking cool. They wear nice-looking suits, smoke cigarettes, and regard the world with cool disdain. Now, the Japanese mafia, or the Yakuza as they're called, are maybe different than kind of the American conception of gangsters. At least as they're portrayed in this film. They look almost like businessmen. I mean, they have short hair, conservative-style haircuts. They wear nice suits and carefully pressed pants. The only thing that seems to distinguish them from businessmen is that they're always wearing sunglasses, even at night. And that's apparently the Yakuza uniform, or at least it is in this film. Almost the entire film takes place at night. And the film makes good use of the loneliness at night. You have lots of shots of characters walking down empty alley streets at night. But there is also an intimacy about night. When the whole world is asleep, it seems like you and the person you are with are the only 2 people who seem alive at the moment. And the film makes good use of this feeling as well. The film opens with a voiceover complaining about how crowded Tokyo has become. And the film has several opening shots establishing the crowds in Tokyo. But then, after these opening shots, for the rest of the movie, Tokyo, or I believe the film is shot in Yokohama, which is a part of Tokyo, or next to Tokyo, is then portrayed as looking deserted for most of the rest of the film. At night, the characters have the streets of Tokyo entirely to themselves. And then there's the excitement of the night. When most decent people are in bed, it seems like there are no rules and anything can happen. At one point, the heroine exclaims, "I would be okay if the morning never comes. I live for these evil nights." As she says this, she presses down on the accelerator and, for no reason except mischief, engages in a race on the highway with the car in front of her. At night, these 2 cars have the entire highway entirely to themselves. And it ends eventually when the other driver stops, laughs with them as if they were good friends, and then drives off, and then just drives off again. Some other notes on the style here. I suppose it's cliché to say that any film noir that's filmed in black and white makes good use of the light and the shadows. But there's good use going on here of the light and the shadows. The characters at points walk in and out of the shadows while walking down the streets. And in one of the opening scenes, the main character embraces his girlfriend and is totally obscured by the shadows, leaving the audience to guess what is happening. Also, the sound of footsteps are amplified a lot in this movie. Whenever a character goes anywhere, you can hear the click, click, click sound of their shoes on the streets. Exactly why this is, I'm not sure. It might again have to do with the emptiness of night, where in the absence of the usual daily noise, the small noise of footsteps seems louder. Or maybe, as I think Roger Ebert is hinting at in his review, the rhythmic sound of the footsteps on the pavement is meant to parallel the rhythmic clicking of the picture plaques being shuffled in the gambling scenes. Or, my friend, the cinephile, thought the footsteps represented the ticking of the clocks. Which brings me to my next point. There is definitely some sort of symbolism going on here with the clocks. I'm not sure exactly what it is, or what it all means, but it's definitely there. One of the characters works and lives in a clock store. In one particularly obvious scene, her lover comes home from prison, and amid the loud clicking of clocks, she asks him, "When did you get out? When? When? When?" So she's saying that while all the clocks are ticking in the background, ticking quite loudly. So it's like, oh, okay, I get it. There's some sort of symbolism going on here with they're saying when, and the clock's going tick, tick, tick. But what exactly this was, aside from just symbolism for the sake of symbolism, which maybe it was, I'm not sure how much this connects to the rest of the story or what deeper theme it's supposed to mean. Maybe somebody a bit sharper than me can spot the connection. Okay, so much for the style. Now on to the story. The story. Well, there's not really much of a story here. And what little story there is gets drawn out over some very slow scenes. A gangster named Meraki gets released from prison and immediately returns to his old life and his old hangouts. At his usual gambling dens, however, he is surprised to find a young, innocent, rich girl gambling among the usual gangsters. No one knows why she is here or what her story is. He is intrigued by her and then becomes in love with her, and she with him. But fate has them on different trajectories. Because of his loyalties to his gang, he engages in a job that he knows will send him right back to jail. While she, meanwhile, is on a self-destructive path, chasing more and more dangerous ways to escape her boredom. Actually, Roger Ebert, in his review, theorizes that he actually didn't need to commit this murder for the gang, or to do this job, which is actually a murder for the gang, because he actually volunteers for it. So I guess depending on your reading, he either volunteered for this job because, who knows, it's not exactly clear, but for some reason, or this was just kind of fate intervening. Now, actually, having described the film like this, it actually sounds very interesting the way I just described it. But it's not. Or the story is not as intense as it sounds, the way I just described it. The action of the film takes up maybe about 15 minutes, all told. And the rest of the film is people having very quiet conversations with each other. Because of this, the film felt very long to me, even though it was really only about 90 minutes. Now, why does the main character fall in love with this girl? I never really understood that, and that hampered my getting involved with the story. She is cute, I'll give her that. And she does look up at him with a doughy-eyed look. And she talks very innocently and correctly. And she obviously comes from a high-class family. And there is a mystery about her. But cute-looking girls are a dime a dozen, as the saying goes. And she doesn't seem to have any deeper personality than this. Plus, she gives multiple indications that she's trouble. She already has a gambling addiction when the main character meets her. And then she is becoming fascinated by drugs. With all the girls that are in the world, why fall in love with this one? Now, granted, a young man might find this attractive, the air of mystery or danger or whatever, but the hero in this story is middle-aged. And a middle-aged man should be past this point of his life when he's finding these type of girls attractive, at least in my opinion. At this point in life, By the time you hit 40, you realize these types of girls are more trouble than they're worth. Right? I don't know. To my mind, the movie gives absolutely no reason why he should fall in love with her. It's simply something we need to accept so that there can be some sort of story here. My friend, the cinephile actually, disagrees with me on this. We discussed it after the film. My friend says it's obvious from the movie that they both have very similar personalities, and they both have trouble connecting to the real world. So the only person each could open up to was the other. Well, perhaps. I didn't get that vibe, but my friend did, so, you know, maybe he's onto something. Maybe he was getting something out of the movie that I didn't. At any rate, I certainly didn't see what the attraction was. And by the end of the movie, I felt like I was so irritated that I felt like he shouldn't be in love with her, and that irritated me. And I wasn't able to sympathize with his feelings at all. And there were other things like this, things where I had trouble making an emotional connection to it, or characters who had emotional turnarounds I didn't understand. There was a young gangster, I think his name was Jiro, who hates our main character, Meraki, and tries to kill him at the beginning of the film. Then, for reasons I never understood, a few scenes later, he has become Meraki's devoted follower and companion. Now, I'm not saying that the emotional transformation from hatred to devotion couldn't have taken place, but the film certainly didn't show it to me or give me any reason to believe it. Okay, other thoughts. From here on out, I'm just going to give a few random observations that just struck me as I was watching this film. Random observation number 1. I did a review on this YouTube channel of the Showa newsreel clips, which was a DVD collection I rented, which was all old newsreel clips from Japan. One of the things that I'm reminded of from that newsreel is during the 1960s, they were making such a big deal about how crowded Tokyo was becoming, which indicated to me that overcrowding in Tokyo was becoming a topical issue at that time. I mean, nowadays, we just take it for granted that Tokyo is overcrowded. But I think in the 1960s, Tokyo, people were just beginning to realize for the first time that Tokyo was becoming overcrowded. I guess there must have been some sort of mass migration into the city at about that time. This film, which came out in 1964, I get the vibe from this film that this is also an issue that's very much on this film's mind, how Tokyo is becoming overcrowded. At least at the beginning, where the opening narration complains about how overcrowded Tokyo has become. And then, like I said, the rest of the film takes place at night, where the characters more or less have the streets all to themselves. But at any rate, the beginning of this movie seems to take place with Tokyo becoming overcrowded. Speaking of the dating of this movie, feels to me that in the 1950s and the 1960s, both in America and Japan, there are a lot of films about bored and restless upper middle class young people who were finding ways to get their kicks or feel alive somehow and find meaning in life, etc. I mean, is it just me, or does it seem like there was a whole glut of movies that came through in the 50s and 60s that had this theme? Which made me think a little bit, actually. I mentioned that because that seems to be the young heroine in this movie. Seems to be of that case. She's got a lot of money, she's bored, she's trying to kind of chase dangerous things as a way to make her feel alive. Which makes me wonder, do we still have this phenomenon nowadays? Do we still make movies like this? Or do young people nowadays have so many media distractions that the feeling of boredom or the feeling of needing to pursue danger in order to stay alive is no longer even relevant? I mean, maybe I'm projecting a little bit here, but I certainly felt like in my 20s and 30s, whenever I felt really bored or restless, I just go on the internet and kind of seek my distractions from the internet or from cable TV or something like that. And that media saturation, at least for me, seemed to kind of get rid of that bored and restless feeling. Now, I've always been an introvert, so maybe that's not a fair comparison to the rest of my generation or the younger generation after me. But I wonder nonetheless, the whole thing of bored and restless young people, is this something that's not as much a theme today as it used to be? Okay. Other observations. This comes from my friend the cinephile, who seemed to get a lot more out of this movie than I did. He said that the film had a very claustrophobic feel, creating by showing lots of characters crammed into small rooms and having lots of close-up of character faces. I never actually noticed this myself. He also said that it was very obvious that the director of this film, Shinoda, is a protege of Ozu, a famous Japanese film director, because they both make a habit of making sure the whole room, from ceiling to floor, is in the shot. I didn't notice this myself either, but this is something my friend picked up on. Lastly, Roger Ebert's review of this film, which again I'll link down below and is worth reading, has a lot of extra information, which is really interesting. Apparently, the original screenplay for this film did not include any of the elaborate gambling scenes in the movie, and instead the only screen directions were they gambled. Now, this is something you almost have to see the movie in order to appreciate what I'm talking about here. But there are these very long, very elaborate, very intricate, very ceremonial gambling scenes in this movie where they make such a big deal about shuffling the picture cards and dealing them out, and there's just such ceremony to it. And watching this, you get the impression that this was a really big part of the intended screenplay. But it turns out it wasn't in the screenplay at all, apparently. It just said they gambled in the screenplay. And in fact, the screenwriter apparently was not happy when he saw how his screenplay had been interpreted by the director with these long, elaborate ceremonial gambling scenes. So that's a little interesting detail, which helps you appreciate this film all the more. And once you've seen the film, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about with these gambling scenes. I'm afraid it's the kind of thing that I really can't do justice to describing it. You really have to see it to appreciate it. Okay, a couple more notes. One of the key plot points in the movie is when someone runs in and informs the gang that Tamaki has been knifed down in the streets. Now, I mentioned I was watching this with two other people, the cinephile and a third friend. At this point, we all turned to each other and said, "Who is Tamaki?" This was a plot point of the movie, but we couldn't figure it out. We still haven't figured it out. So if anybody out there knows who Tamaki is or why it's significant that he got knifed down in the street, let me know down in the comments. Okay, that's all the thoughts I have on this movie. Yeah, again, if anyone got more out of this movie than I did, please let me know in the comments down below.